Raise your hand if you do not like to feel and deal with hard emotions. I struggle with this so much because for me, heavy, negative emotions feel so difficult and hindering to my movement forward. But to be human is to have emotions. And sometimes those emotions are hard, and sometimes those emotions are maybe even confusing. Welcome to the Cycle of Care podcast. I'm your host, Mona Zignago. Today, we are going to talk about negative emotions and ways to work with the brain productively so that we can move forward with more wisdom and better regulation when it comes to difficult emotional moments in our lives. Now, before we begin, I want to make an important distinction. This episode is focused on strategies for navigating emotional escalation during some of the difficult moments we experience in daily life. It is not meant to minimize profound grief, trauma, abuse, or major loss. Those experiences require deep healing, support, therapy, and time. This podcast is not for those situations. The goal here is to better understand our brains so we can move through everyday emotional moments with greater awareness and care. Intense, negative emotions in our everyday lives can be hard. They can surprise us, shut us down, and freeze us, rendering us unable to productively troubleshoot and move forward. When we feel intense emotions, regulating those emotions effectively can be hard. If you have listened to my show before, you know how much I love research, so here's what research tells us. When we have emotions, there is a lot going on. A large part of our brain is activated. It's called the limbic system. The limbic system is composed of brain regions such as, stay with me here, the amygdala, hippocampus, and the insula. The limbic system tracks our emotions, connections to objects, people, and happenings in our lives. The brain wants to keep us alive, and our brain wants to keep us safe. So, sometimes the brain is helpful for those things, and sometimes the brain isn't as helpful. So, today, we are going to spend some time understanding our brain and emotions and how to work with the brain productively so that we are not at the mercy of a negative emotion. Using strategies to understand our negative emotions will allow us to lessen those emotions or maybe at least neutralize them so that we can make better and more objective decisions. We know from research that we do not make good decisions when we are escalated, elevated, or anxious. In fact, during those times, we're actually pretty limited in our ability to process information correctly. Our threshold for dealing with incoming threats is low, and our ability to interpret incoming information correctly is not strong. So, again, remember, these strategies I'm about to share with you are not about minimizing profound pain, trauma, grief, or major life loss. Those are experiences in life like death or abuse, traumatic events, or devastating diagnoses that are not meant to be quickly strategized away. Those experiences require some grieving, support, therapy, time, and care under the care of a licensed professional. What we're talking about today are strategies that can help us regulate everyday emotional escalation and many difficult moments so that we can think more clearly and respond more intentionally. These tools are meant to support us and not silence our emotions or invalidate real suffering. So, the research from this episode comes from my book, Transforming Teaching Through the Cycle of Care, which, by the way, just won an award that I'm very excited about. And also from another great book called Your Brain at Work by David Rock. Your Brain at Work is a valuable book for understanding the brain and how the brain works so that we can live more full, contented, and productive lives. Today, I'm going to start by talking about a story about a student from my book, Transforming Teaching Through the Cycle of Care. This excerpt from my book is from a day when I was having some strong emotions at work, so here we go. My student was more dysregulated on this cold Midwestern day than I had ever witnessed. Kira was wandering the halls anxiously between classes and couldn't seem to stay in her seat. At this school, wandering the halls anxiously between classes wasn't allowed. During this time in my teaching career, I was working in a small urban high school. There were rules and regulations meant to enhance learning as well as keep everyone safe. One rule was to stay in classrooms during class. The administrators wanted to provide a high-quality education for students that drew from the rich and beautiful experiences and strengths that the students possessed. Thus, they really wanted the students in classrooms learning. Additionally, far too many of the students that we served came to us with severe trauma from domestic and societal violence, abductions, poverty, alcoholism, and drug-addicted environments. Our administrative leadership wanted them to feel safe and cared for, and they felt teachers couldn't do that if students weren't in their rooms. Kiera's whole energy was anxious and jittery. She couldn't seem to focus, and she seemed unable to refrain from walking the halls. It was an incredibly busy day with what felt like a million things hitting me all at once. And I found myself really struggling not to be annoyed as I noticed her continued appearances in the halls as the day wore on. However, after watching Kiera walking the halls and listening to teachers directing her back to her classroom for what felt like the umpteenth time, I felt a whisper of fear in the back of my mind that perhaps there was something wrong. I took a deep breath to care for myself and moved myself into a space where I could disassociate from my tasks at hand and focus only on her. I was rewarded by a reminder of the cycle of care that is given and received between teachers and students, which also existed between myself and Kiera. I needed to show her that I cared about her and potentially get to the bottom of what was happening, if she was willing to share with me. I took Kiera aside and brought her into what I hoped were the warm and caring confines of my classroom. I asked her how she was doing and if there was anything I could do to support her on this day. I mentioned how much I cared about her and reassured her that I was here for her, whether she felt like talking or not. To my surprise, she proceeded to tell me the story of how she lived with her uncle, who had poured water on the sidewalk during the night outside her home and let it freeze. He then proceeded to wake Kiera up by telling her there was a fire and she needed to get outside. When she ran outside, she slipped on the ice and bumped her head. So, as a result, she had a really bad headache and was very dysregulated from the experience. In a flash, my emotions went from irritation to anger. I had so many emotions, honestly. And Kiera probably had a lot of emotions too. Maybe she felt unsafe, angry, sad, or bitter. Okay, so now coming back to our conversation now, away from reading this excerpt from my book, we can see that I had choices that I made that day. I could have lived unconsciously in my emotions of irritation and frustration, or I could consciously decide to wonder what those emotions were telling me and do something about them by gathering more information. That is what the cycle of care element of listening looks like. It is consciously gathering data to make informed decisions about how to move forward. So I could choose to not gather more data or information from Kiera and continue to be annoyed and frustrated and potentially as a result maybe label and stereotype her, or I could feel my emotions, name them, analyze them, understand them, and get to the bottom of what the heck is going on. Here's what we know. Suppressing our emotions only makes things worse. It takes a lot of cognitive energy to suppress an emotion. This leaves us with fewer resources for us to use in the moment and pay attention to what is going on. What research shows us is that there are ways to work with emotions to regulate ourselves and move forward productively. One strategy is to label the emotion. Labeling emotions restores thinking through activating the prefrontal cortex, calming our limbic system, and restoring clarity. In one study, when participants were in a functional MRI machine, when the participants labeled emotional faces using words, less activity occurred in the amygdala area of the brain. Now, this is an important finding because when the amygdala is ticked off, it makes accidental connections and misinterprets incoming information. This can lead to errors in interpreting what is really happening around us. The problem is, most people think that voicing their feelings will make things worse, not better, so as a result, they don't discuss their feelings. And I get it. There are plenty of studies that show that speaking about emotional experiences does bring the emotions back up to the surface again, but the key here is how we do this. To reduce arousal, what we need to do is to describe the emotion in a one word or two. Let me say that again. A word or two. This helps reduce the emotion. If we open up a huge conversation about the emotions, though, research shows we tend to increase the emotion. So we want to stick to a word or two. Now, folks who are successful with labeling as a way to reduce arousal over time are able to quiet their minds so they can still think clearly. They have trained their minds to deal better with emotions through this labeling process. So, one strategy we can do is to label the emotion in one or two words to try to quiet the mind so that we can shift into clear, focused thinking. Okay, that is strategy number 1. Let's talk about strategy number 2 for when strategy number 1 isn't cutting it. Our brains like certainty. The brain likes to think ahead, picture the future, and map out what is going to happen and how. If there is one thing we know, it is that time and time again, scientists see that a sense of control over something stressful lessens the stressor's impact. Interestingly enough, with this idea of control, the brain feels more in control when it has choices. In fact, research has shown that choices about how to experience stress lessens the stress. Even the smallest perception of choice reduces limbic system arousal. This is a really good thing to know to understand ourselves and others around us. For example, imagine you are overwhelmed at work and emotional after a difficult conversation. You may not have control over what just happened, but you do have choices in how you move forward. Here are some examples. You might choose to go for a walk before responding. Write your thoughts down first. Ask for time before making a decision. Call someone you trust. Or consciously reframe the situation. Research shows that even those small choices restore a sense of control to the brain. And this control matters because when the brain feels trapped or powerless, it moves further into a threat state. But when we perceive choice, even small choices, our nervous system begins to chill out a bit and calm down, and this helps us think more clearly. That is where our number 2 strategy of reappraisal steps in. Reappraisal means giving our brains choices by consciously reframing or reinterpreting a situation in a way that changes its emotional impact. It does not mean denying reality or pretending something painful did not happen. What it means is that you're giving yourself a choice to look at the situation from another angle so that your brain can regulate and move forward more productively. For example, instead of thinking, this feedback I'm getting means I'm failing, you might reappraise it as, this feedback is difficult, but it gives me information I can sort through thoughtfully. There might be something in here that is helpful. Instead of, this person is attacking me, you might think, this conversation is activating something in me, but I do not have to react impulsively. I can give myself permission to step back and take a minute to respond. Research from David Rock's work shows that reappraisal gives us choices and thus helps reduce activity in the emotional centers of the brain while increasing activation in the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for reasoning, perspective taking, and thoughtful decision making. In other words, reappraisal helps us move from reaction to reflection, and this matters deeply within the cycle of care. This is because when we reappraise, we strengthen relationships by slowing down judgments and deficit-based assumptions. We improve listening by shifting from being defensive to being more reflective. We engage in flexible thinking by examining multiple ways of interpreting situations, and we improve responding by acting intentionally and thoughtfully instead of impulsively. So essentially, reappraisal helps us move from what is wrong with me to what is happening inside of me, from I'm trapped in a certain response to I have choices. And what we know from research is that often that choice creates enough of a shift to help us move forward. So, labeling the emotion is strategy number 1, and reappraisal is strategy number 2. Reappraisal means looking at the situation differently so that the brain can reduce threat and regain a sense of control. David Rock explains that there are 4 main types of reappraisal. The first type is reinterpreting. This is when we decide that something we first experienced as threatening may not actually be a threat. For example, maybe I see a student walking the halls and my first interpretation is she is being defiant. But when I pause and gather more information, I may reinterpret the situation and realize actually she's dysregulated. Something is wrong. She needs care. Reinterpreting helps us change our raw emotional response to an event, which means asking ourselves, could there be another explanation for what is happening? Our brains are constantly trying to make meaning out of situations. The problem is when we are emotionally activated, the brain often fills in missing information with threat-based assumptions. For example, maybe a colleague walks past you without speaking, and suddenly your brain says, they're upset with me. But reinterpretation invites us to pause and consider, maybe they're not upset with me. Maybe they're distracted. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe this actually has nothing to do with me. That small shift matters because it calms the brain down and interrupts the emotional spiral before it has time to escalate. The second type is normalizing. Normalizing means reminding ourselves that our emotional response makes sense. If we are in a new situation under pressure or facing uncertainty, it is normal to feel overwhelmed. Instead of shaming ourselves by saying, why am I reacting this way? We can say, of course I feel unsettled. This is new. This is hard. My brain is trying to figure out what's happening. Rock explains that giving an experience an explanation can reduce uncertainty and increase a sense of control. Normalization means recognizing that our emotional responses make sense given the situation. Sometimes we might shame ourselves for having emotions in the first place. We might think, why am I reacting like this? Why can't I handle this better? But normalization sounds more like, of course I'm anxious. This matters to me. Of course I'm overwhelmed. I'm carrying a lot on my shoulders right now. Normalization reduces the brain's sense of danger because we give ourselves choices to stop treating the emotion itself like a threat. The third type is reordering. This one's a little more complex. Reordering means looking again at the value or importance we are assigning to parts of a situation. Sometimes our brain puts something at the top of the hierarchy that may not deserve to be there. Maybe we're giving too much weight to someone's criticism, one difficult email, or one stressful meeting. Reordering asks, is this really as important as my brain is making it right now? And it helps us place the situation in a healthier hierarchy. This strategy asks, is this situation truly as catastrophic as my brain is making it seem? When we are emotionally flooded, the brain does tend to magnify things. A difficult email feels like the end of the world. One piece of criticism can feel like total failure. One awkward interaction can feel devastating. Reevaluation helps us zoom out and say, this does matter, but it doesn't define me. This is difficult, but it's temporary. This moment is part of my life, but it doesn't deserve to be at the top of the hierarchy. It's not the entirety of it. The fourth type is taking another person's perspective. This is when we intentionally try to see the situation through someone else's eyes. Maybe we ask, what might this person be experiencing? Or what would I see if I stepped outside my own immediate reaction? This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior by any stretch of the imagination, but it does mean giving ourselves choices so that we're not trapped inside our first emotional interpretation. This means intentionally shifting perspective. Sometimes we're so deep inside our emotional experience that we lose the ability to see clearly. Repositioning invites us to ask, what would I say to a friend in this situation? How might I see this 5 years from now? What would be the calmest, wisest version of myself here? This strategy widens perspective and creates space between us and the emotion. So, if we go back to the story about Kiara, I had a choice. I could stay in my emotion of irritation, or I could reappraise. I could reinterpret what was happening. I could normalize my own stress in that busy moment. I could reorder what mattered most and realize that her safety mattered more than my irritation. And I could take her perspective by wondering what might be happening in her world. That is why reappraisal connects so strongly to the cycle of care. Reinterpreting helps us listen more accurately. Normalizing helps us care for ourselves without shame. Reordering helps us think more clearly about what matters most. Taking another person's perspective helps us respond with more wisdom and more care. Reappraisal does not mean pretending everything is fine. It means working with the brain to give choices so we can move from threat to clarity, from reaction to response, and from emotional flooding back into care. And all 4 of these strategies connect beautifully to the cycle of care. Reinterpretation strengthens listening because it helps us gather more information instead of jumping to conclusions. Normalization strengthens relationships because it allows us to treat ourselves and others with compassion instead of shame. Reevaluation strengthens thinking because it helps us move from emotional exaggeration toward clarity. And repositioning strengthens responding because it creates enough distance for intentional action instead of impulsive reaction. What I love about reappraisal is that it reminds us of something really important. We are not powerless inside our emotions. We may not be able to control what happens to us. We may not be able to control the first emotional reaction that rises up inside of us, but we can learn to work with the brain in ways that hopefully can help us move from emotional dysregulation back into a more objective, focused state. Let's move into our reflection activity. The reflection activity for today is called I Have Choices. To do this activity, you would first pause and name the emotion that you're feeling in just a couple words. Remember, research shows that labeling emotions can help calm the limbic system and restore clearer thinking. So ask yourself, what are 2 words I can use to name the emotion that I'm feeling? I'm going to give you a few emotion words as examples. Anxious, overwhelmed, frustrated, dismissed, embarrassed, angry, sad, hurt, disappointed. Once you have named the emotion that is real for you, take a deep breath. Remind yourself, I am not powerless inside this emotion. I have choices. Next, ask yourself, is there another way to look at this situation? Can I reinterpret the situation? Could there be another explanation besides the first one my brain jumped to? Can I normalize this situation to better understand why I'm upset? Does it make sense that I'm feeling this way, given what's happening? Can I reorder the situation into a more balanced perspective? Am I giving this moment more power or importance than it deserves? Can I take another person's perspective? What might this situation look like through someone else's eyes? Now, pause again and notice what's happening inside your body as you move through those questions. Notice whether the emotional intensity shifts even slightly. Notice whether your thinking becomes more clear, calmer, or grounded. The goal isn't necessarily to completely eliminate the emotion, but rather to move from those emotions that take away clarity back into awareness, back into thoughtful decision making, and back into just really caring for yourself. And this is important because you may not control the first emotion that rises inside of you, but you can choose what you do next. You can choose to be curious instead of making assumptions. You can choose reflection instead of impulsivity, and you can choose care instead of reacting. That is emotional regulation. That is wisdom. And that is the cycle of care in action. So, as we close out today's episode, I'd love for you to remember, having hard emotions doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're human. Our brains are constantly trying to protect us. Sometimes they do that beautifully, and sometimes they overreact, misinterpret, catastrophize, or pull us into threat states that disconnect us from our clearest thinking and deepest values. But all is not lost, because we are not powerless inside those moments. Today we talked about what happens in the brain when emotions rise. We explored how the limbic system can hijack our thinking, and how suppressing emotions actually makes regulation harder, not easier. We discussed how naming emotions can calm the brain and restore clarity, and we explored reappraisal, the powerful reminder that we have choices in how we interpret, normalize, reorder, and respond to difficult situations. And honestly, that idea of choice is everything, because when we are able to remember that we have choices, we move from feeling trapped to feeling empowered. We are able to move from reaction to reflection, from impulsivity to intentionality, and from emotional dysregulation back into focus and clarity. That is what the cycle of care is about. It is about building strong relationships with ourselves and others. It is about listening deeply instead of assuming. It is about thinking clearly instead of reacting automatically. And it is about responding with wisdom, care, and awareness. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but consciously. And maybe that's the real work of being human. Not eliminating the hard emotions, but learning how to move through them with greater compassion, understanding, and regulation. So, the next time you feel emotionally overwhelmed, pause. Name the emotion. Remember that you have choices. Give yourself permission to reappraise the situation and remind yourself difficult moments do not define who you are. You are still capable of clarity. You are still capable of care. You are still capable of thoughtful response. And that ability to return to care even when emotions run high is real strength. As we close out today's episode, I want to say thank you. Thank you for showing up, for listening, for caring, for choosing to make space for reflection, care, and growth in our world. Let's join together in this community and turn the tide. Let's bring more care into the world together. If this message today resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And whether you've been here from the beginning or whether this is your first episode, thank you. This community matters. You matter. You can connect with me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, TikTok, or at my website, monazignego.com. And you can learn even more about care, reflection, and transformative teaching in my book, Transforming Teaching Through the Cycle of Care. Thanks again for listening. I'm Mona Zignego, and this is the Cycle of Care podcast. Until next time, take care, move forward, and commit to care.
This podcast and all episodes within the Cycle of Care series is intended for educational and reflective purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional mental health care, therapy, or counseling. If you are experiencing emotional distress or need support, please seek guidance from a licensed mental health professional.